Check 1, 2.
All right. Is that better?
It sounds okay. It's just
Okay.
that the first mic sounded a lot better. Like
See,
perfectly
that's what's
legible.
interesting is I thought that okay.
Now you're
Oh,
quiet.
man.
Now you went quiet.
Yeah.
Man, we use Discord
All
for
right.
meetings
So
every
back
day.
to this mic. Is that better?
Okay. Yeah.
Yep, yeah,
Sounds
we can
good.
hear you now.
I ended up having to do recording on this one because the M1 is screwing with my sound stuff for some reason.
And now I can't hear y'all. Why can I not hear?
Well, I'll tell him again when he comes back around.
To be... Weird. Okay. Sorry. Now I'm back. I don't know why I decided not to let me hear you anymore.
But you can hear us now. Cool.
I can hear you now. Yes. How's this mic any better?
It's
okay.
Sounds good.
All right.
It's good either way. So, you may have had your gain up on the one that you thought was really good. Your gain may have been too high. I don't know. So
yeah,
that might have been
and I
the
was
issue.
switching devices real fast, and so who knows?
Yeah.
Well, and who knows how Windows treats Apple AirPods too?
Right. There's that.
Yeah.
And how the AirPods treat Windows. Let's be honest.
Yes, it is a two-way thing.
Yes. So we're gonna end up recording tonight, just so you guys know, instead of live streaming, just because the M1 is screwing with my settings. We couldn't make me sound anywhere near proper for some reason. I'm hoping it comes out well in the recording. I tested it earlier and all sounded fine. So we shall see. But yeah. Apparently, I've been doing the Sergeant Ollie voice for a while, Benjamin. You've heard that many a time, that voice.
Yeah, I know that one.
And so I've been using a filter in OBS on Windows, and turns out Apple Silicon has completely discontinued any sort of capacity for VST plugins, VST 2 point whatever plugins, which is ridiculous. So anyway. But yeah, I tried just turning up high band on the equalizer really high and turn all the others down to give it the tin can vibe, and apparently it screwed everything up because they said I sounded like some kind of alien. So anyway, yeah. So this discussion is going to be one that you and I have had many a time on your porch with a cigar and some old fashions. I think is your favorite thing. It's usually what you serve me. So
that or a Jack and Coke.
There you go. So in that regard, we can talk whatever, however, especially being recording now instead of live. But do you want to introduce the guys to the topic from the perspective of what we've said already to each other?
Well, I think you're going to have a better brush up on that than I will.
Yeah.
Just because y'all have talked it more recently.
Right. Well, the main crux of it, to jog your memory, is the GIF versus GIF argument.
Yeah. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And authorial intent versus death of the author versus a third thing or a fourth thing, whatever else you want to bring to the table. The main one that I tried to bring to the table is, what does God think about the matter? And yes, that's somewhat of a Jesus juke, but I think we can actually pull inferences from scripture in that regard.
Well,
yeah,
yes. Ahead. And to tip my hand, my core argument is going to be anchored in God's character, and that being him as the definition for truth and beauty.
Right. Yes, definitely. You want to say hi real quick, Hazel? Go ahead, say hi to everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey, Hazel.
Hazel.
You're gonna go hang out with Mama?
Yeah.
For a little bit and then go to bed?
Yeah.
Alrighty, I love you. All right, bring it back over. Okay, so yeah, basically, I guess, does anyone want to go first as far as this goes and just jump into the topic, give an example, and give your opinion, kind of a thing? Otherwise, I guess I can, but I'm just throwing it out there for anybody because this is a fun discussion I've had many times with Benjamin and more recently with you guys. So I kind of want to let's anyone want to dive in? Anyone want to volunteer? Alex is shaking his head no. He's like,
I can throw something out there,
Go
but
ahead.
I'm not sure that will be
it's a starting
giantly
point.
helpful.
It'll be a starting point.
Yeah. So as far as research that I did before this episode, I went back and listened to an episode of Stories Are Soul Food, the one that I sent in the Brood, on the director's fault. It's the one where he talks about, where Nate talks about the difference between Spielberg and like your Wes Anderson, Christopher Nolan types. And one of the things that he got into that once you his philosophy is that once a writer puts their work out into the public, it stands on its own, and they no longer have like the authority to define what it does. The particular case being J.K. Rowling with Harry Potter, that she doesn't get to say, "Okay, no, Dumbledore was gay all along," because it's not in the text, and she wrote the text, and so she had authority over it at that point in time. But once it's put out, the text is the authority, and if you can find it in the text, then it's there, but you don't get to retroactively say, no, it actually is whenever it isn't. Which seems like a kind of middle ground on Death of the Author, because unless I'm completely missing what that phrase means.
Do you want to define Death of the author from your perspective?
As far as the way that I understand it, Death of the Author is that the author has no interpretive control over the way that their work is understood in any way, shape, or form. They don't get to give context. They don't get to give any form of deeper understanding. And this is what I was trying to do. This is the thought process that I had behind it. That has no weight or bearing at all. It is entirely up to the individual reader's interpretation, the individual viewer's interpretation of what the author was saying.
And I would say
That's
a light version of that would be saying that if it's not in the text, it's not canon, right? And there is folks that would say that without going all the way to my interpretation is king, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so the big one to bring up immediately, like you mentioned briefly, was J.K. Rowling, Dumbledore's gay, et cetera, and rereading something back into it. Does the author have the ability to change something after the fact? And if we immediately say no, we have some major plot holes in The Hobbit. But yeah, I mean,
well, there is a difference between saying no, this is what this is what it actually means in spite of what I wrote, and re-editing it.
Right. Yes. So,
which is what Tolkien did with The Hobbit. He went back and said, no, re-edit. This is what the actual story is, and it's explained in universe and all that. Tolkien gets a pass because he's Tolkien.
Right. So, Brendan, you haven't chimed in yet. Is there anything you want to add yet or not yet?
Part of the issue that I run in, I am a very strong authorial intent person. I'm pro authorial intent highly. However, I think part of the issue that we run into is that I have a couple points. One, I want to wait on until we all hash out. But basically, I guess Benjamin tipped his hand. I'm in the same camp as him to a certain degree. My authorial intent standard is because of God and his word, and his word being the standard. Maybe. We can't just say what God intended with his word didn't matter. We can't say that. That's not. Now, I agree to a certain degree with Alex that like part of me wants to agree and go, once the text is out there, the text stands on its own. But at the same time, I think that's also the people who go back and retroactively go, oh no, Dumbledore was gay the whole time, is like, I think that's being disingenuous for the authorial intent crowd, because the authorial intent has to be at the point of writing.
Yeah.
So we're not talking about what the author intends after they wrote it. We're talking about what the
Yeah.
author intends when they wrote it.
Right.
Yes.
And then that leads into the last point of, while, yes, our standard needs to be Christ, and this is the same reason why I don't think words should change meaning. Because the word does not change. Therefore, words, in imitating what they are, in imitating the higher form of the word, they should not change. The fact of the matter is, we're all flawed human beings. We're all sinful. We are all, and it could be either a moral error, or it could be a just straight up a skill issue, if you pardon the internet slang. You know,
Mhm.
if somebody if J.K. Rowling intended Dumbledore to be gay from the get-go, if that was her intention from the very beginning, and she
Mhm.
didn't put it in the text, that's her fault.
Yeah.
And she can't. Well, I say it's her fault. It's also the fact that there's a limited, skill thing. And so I don't know where I fall on that particular issue. It's not one that I've excuse me. It's not one that I've thought a whole great deal about, because frankly, anytime anyone mentions any LGBTQ stuff, my brain just turns off. But
Mhm.
but like, yeah, again, for me, it's authorial intent should hold the majority of the weight, because God wrote in his word,
Mhm.
or God wrote his word in a sense with his word,
Mhm.
and his intent for scripture is
Mhm.
literally the whole point of why we study the Bible.
Right.
Mhm.
We need to know what God wants. We need to know what God is intending. And so
Mhm.
that's why we study the scriptures.
Right.
And by the same token, as sub-creators imitating the creator, we need to treat the sub-creators similarly. Now, obviously, the sub-creators, I'm not saying that we're going to treat J.K. Rowling as God. I'm not saying we're treating Tolkien as God. I'm not saying we're treating anyone as God. But we need to acknowledge their authority over the text when they wrote the text.
Mhm.
Right? And what was their
Yes.
intent at the time? Now, how do we determine that? That's an entirely different question, and one I don't have a good answer to. How do you know what the
Mhm.
author was intending at the time?
Unless
Read
they
the
tell
text.
you. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, unless
Mhm.
they tell you at the time. And that's the thing. Like, I think there's a difference between someone saying, "Oh, no, in the world of for this, you asked me this question. In the world of this is the answer," and the person goes, "But that
Mhm.
doesn't line up with the book," and the author going, "Yeah, well, at the time I meant it to do this, but I didn't really do a good enough job of explaining
Yeah.
it." Like, there's
Mhm.
now we're getting into the humanity of the interaction, and that's not something I
Yeah.
think we can safely talk about.
So with that in
Sorry.
mind, let me throw a slightly bigger wrench into the works. Obviously, there are parallels
You
here
never do that.
for revelation and for our epistemology, how we know what we know. But this is not the whole of how we know what we know. And there may be some slight differences based upon situations. And also, a nonfiction book, I would argue, can be and usually is epistemologically different. How we know things about Narnia has to be analogical, right? Whereas
Mhm.
something that we learn from a nonfiction book that is, completely based in our reality, is a different kind of revelation, quote unquote, to us than a fictional world where we're having to imagine things, right? There's analog in fiction. You're using analogy and analog to get something across, as opposed, and it's not just the morals. I'm not just talking morals, but I have no experience to what a fawn is, but I do have experience to what a goat and what a man are, and I use my imagination to put them together, right? And so that might be a difference too. I'm just throwing out that possibility. Benjamin, do you have anything so far?
Yeah, a lot of different thoughts. One, what I'm hearing is writers need to do a better job
That's right.
world building
Yes.
and actually take seriously the art that they are attempting to dive into. You'd have a lot less problems if that was the case. A lot less interpretation, a lot less headcanon.
Right.
Yep.
But then also, I'm just curious to pull the room here. Who here thinks that Han shot first?
Who's the Han shot first, gate people? Maybe, sure. Doesn't really matter to me. Doesn't really matter to me.
It's whichever one was in the 77 version.
That's Han shot first, I believe. Yeah.
That one.
Yeah. So Han shot first. Yeah.
Pretty sure that
Special editions don't count.
Even though the author re-edited and re-released the work.
It works in that. In that specific version, but I don't particularly enjoy the special editions.
Oh no,
I prefer the original one that I watched, the original 77. So it does work inside of that, but the other differences between Tolkien's re-edit and Lucas's re-edit. Lucas just re-edited and said, this is how it is now. Tolkien re-edited and said, this is the story that Bilbo told people.
Right.
He
gave a reason for the original to exist.
He gave an in-universe, he gave a canon reason as to why the original Hobbit existed the way that it did. Lucas didn't. He just said, this is how it is now, like it or not.
Right.
I'm going to go destroy the originals or whatever.
No more Christmas special.
He pulled a Disney before it was cool.
Oh boy. So in that regard, how, I guess the thing that I have a question for the people who are for especially authorial intent. Is this authorial intent unless God says different? Because we have a clear passage, for example, in Genesis with Joseph, what you meant for evil, he meant for good. So we have that and many other places where, sin itself, right? God uses it and turns it back to good, right? And so how do we take that with the understanding of authorial intent? Is it authorial intent until God says different because he's above? Or is it, is there a place for someone else's interpretation having a stronger bearing over time? Because let's say, as an example, we have lots of variations on things like Cinderella and old fairy tales where we do not have very much about the intention of the author at all, if anything. And the text is the text. And at that point, what does it mean? You see what I'm saying? So there's a point to where there is influence, at the very least, of one's own interpretation. So what's the hierarchy here? I'm trying to bring in the legitimacy of these other things so that we can figure out what is what, right?
Why is one story legitimate but another not?
Good question. Go ahead.
Okay. So, I feel like you've got two questions going on there.
I do. Pick one.
One can be summarized with the problem of Barbie. The other is summarized with the swarm of Cinderella and all of the variations therein.
Okay.
So I'm going to handle the second one first because I think that's the easiest to just kind of give an explanation and let it sit there. And the other one you have to actually dig. Remember when we were talking about Alice in Wonderland, how Alice in Wonderland became intellectual property in 1980 something?
You mean public domain?
Or public domain,
yeah.
Public domain in 1980 something.
Yeah.
And so everyone and their grandfather started making variations of Alice in Wonderland to the point where Alice in Wonderland was no longer a story, it was a setting.
Right.
In which they could write their own stories. I think all of the stories in that instance are valid because they're not Alice in Wonderland. They're using Alice in Wonderland as a backdrop. And so within that framework, we can quibble about whether or not they did a good job or if they could have just dropped the Alice in Wonderland facade and did their own world building. And as Benjamin said, get good at their craft. But that's at that point we're quibbling, right? And I don't think that the variations of Alice in Wonderland that came up are in any way, shape, or form a threat to the original.
Okay.
Same thing with the Cinderellas.
Yeah.
Now, the Barbie problem. This is where things get harder. And the only way that I can explain this is that, okay, first of all, for those of you who don't know what the Barbie problem is, the Barbie movie came out relatively recently, and it was supposed to be this feminist, empowering movie. But a very, very large contingent of people noticed that actually Ken's the good guy.
Yes.
And not only is Ken the good guy, but Ken actually does the majority of the heavy lifting through the movie. And not only that, but if you actually look at the story with Ken as the main character, not only is he the protagonist, but he's the one who frees people from the oppressive matriarchy and brings about a patriarchy that actually helps.
Right.
The movie is accidentally based and pro-patriarchy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is what they're saying, but it's definitely not what I say. It's definitely not. I haven't heard directly from Greta or the authors per se, but it's 99.999% not what their intent was. So what do we do with that?
Right.
And I think the answer to that question is, remember what I said, and this is what you meant for evil, God meant for good.
Right.
This is where the flaw and the sinful nature of man comes in.
Mm-hmm.
And while God can say, all right, I'm going to take this story and I'm going to hijack it, that doesn't deny the intent of the author, I don't think.
Right.
I think what happens is the society in which the author wrote the story, they while they have interpretive power, like they can't say what the story was intending to do, but what they can say is, even though the story was intending to do this bad thing, or was intending to say this bad thing, he couldn't help it but include this good thing because he's made in the image of God.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not he was trying, even if he was trying full force to spit into God's face with the book, we're human, we're flawed, and this is a good thing because it also means that we are really bad at sinning sometimes.
Yeah.
That's the only thing
Yeah.
I can think of on that front.
Okay.
So I'm sorry I had
And
this tendency to go really long. I apologize.
No, you're good. That was good stuff.
No. Yeah. I really, really like what you and Benjamin were saying as far as modeling the way that you read the Bible and taking that to the way that you read other works. The reason I posted the meme that I posted in Green Dragon Tap Room is because that last one, is God a clear communicator? Yes. God is a clear communicator. And so whatever he communicated in the Bible, like the text stands for itself, is perfectly communicated. Asterisks, textual criticism, understand how the manuscripts came to be,
Right.
all that type of stuff. There's fun stuff to be talked about in there. But at the end of the day, God is a clear communicator, and he communicated what he was intending to perfectly in the text of the scripture.
Right.
Therefore, perfectly the text stands.
Right.
With other authors, they do not communicate perfectly, like Benjamin was saying. And so you have to understand that there are asterisks there. Okay, they didn't communicate this perfectly. Was this something that they, did not intend to be there? And then you go ask them and they say, oh, no, I totally intended that to be there. That was there from the start, all that. At which point in time, you understand that and you read that into your understanding of the writing. But they don't get to come in and say, yeah, no, this completely foreign thing gets added in that isn't at all in the text.
Right.
They don't have that authority.
Yeah, and hijacking that thought a little bit, let me go back to our your premise about the Bible and God communicating perfectly. He communicates perfectly, but in that we don't interpret perfectly.
Yes.
And that same thing carries through to all forms of communication. And so that's what we also have happening when people consume art. They interpret it through their sinful lens. And so even
Yeah.
something that is true and beautiful and good can be either accidentally or these days intentionally misinterpreted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I think it's incumbent upon not just artists, but also those enjoying the art to teach themselves how to better enjoy art,
Yeah.
to recognize
Eh,
beauty and to
Yeah.
learn what it is. I think that's a requirement. You know, not to be art snobs or anything of that nature, but
Mhm.
to learn how
Mhm.
to recognize what is good and beautiful. I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
that is just as helpful as it is for the author to be able to learn how to write it. I think, yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's something we've been kind of
Mhm.
asking ourselves, like, how do we teach
Mhm.
people how to enjoy beauty? And that's something that I was going to ask every guest we had on. How do we teach ourselves as well as others to appreciate true beauty? And then we only had one guest on, and so I haven't been able to ask that question to anyone else. But
Hey,
Go
we've
for
had
it.
2, I
Here's
think.
another one. Go
Mhm.
ahead.
So we will ask you that question, Benjamin, in a moment. But I think I just really want to highlight. I really want to highlight that the fact that we are sinful people. So our interpretation is also flawed, not just the creation, right? We have
Yeah.
to be careful not to let either the author, even as an authorial intent person, we need to be careful
Mhm.
not to let either the author's book or the interpretation or the interpreter become higher than the other. They're both sinful. They both have
Mhm.
problems. And within that paradigm, the authorial intent is important. At least for me.
Yeah.
Right. So, Benjamin, how do we teach people how to appreciate beauty? Here, get thrown into the deep end.
Woo,
I worked
boy.
this
I
the
mean,
other
I
day.
love this. I love this question. And I love questions like it. And I'm going to try not to do the political dodge here. I'm going to actually get to it, but I'm going to.
You got
That's
no,
a great question. You know, let's talk about this now.
you gotta start laying groundwork, dude. We all do that here.
Yes, yes. Well, this is something I've found just as I've interacted with the arts and churches and people uh, who should be some of the most theologically thoughtful,
Mhm.
oftentimes are not in their applied theology. And that's something I'm seeing in Western culture, especially, that we have really failed. We've really failed in our applied theology. We've really failed to see the beauty of the gospel and then go, I want to make this church look just as beautiful as what I'm reading.
Yep.
You know, I want why Piper got in so much trouble, but I think he is one who does think deeply about this,
Mhm.
but not being an artist in the traditional sense, he doesn't know how to lay out a philosophy for it. But when he posed
Mhm.
on Twitter that we should rethink coffee in the sanctuary, he's onto something. He's onto that track.
Yeah.
He's onto we need to think about worship. We need to think more deeply about worship
Mhm.
and apply what we know about worship to what we're doing with our hands.
Yep.
And so we need to take that and apply that to when we stand, when we sit. And so all these things, and that's just 1 degree removed. Like these are
Mhm.
the obvious things that we're still not getting for whatever reason,
Yeah.
at least, especially within Reformed Baptist circles. It's a frustration. One of these days we'll mature and get that part. I'm envious of our Presbyterian friends and our Anglican friends who
We're
have
not
beautiful
much better.
buildings.
We're not much better. Let's be
Well, at
honest.
No,
least y'all
not
were
really.
born. Y'all were born and baptized into
We have a
a
tradition. Yeah, we have a tradition.
a
At all.
tradition that at least your fathers prioritize beauty
Right.
more than utility.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
And obviously it has to be a bit of both. Okay,
Right.
we can't not do something just because we can't achieve perfect beauty. We have to first recognize that perfect beauty is only found in God. We are always going to have poor reflections of it, but that
Mhm.
doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
Yeah.
So yeah, how do we teach that? Man, I think we start with what's right in front of us. So there's much talk about the Protestant or Christian work ethic. Like that's the most obvious outpouring of applied theology. And excuse me, and it seems to be something that still exists in some circles, but it isn't quite as clear cut as it used to be. Because now we've got people who are workaholics, and it's like, okay, well, they've made idols of work instead of properly understanding its place within our mandate as Imago Dei.
Yeah.
So, yeah, because one day I'm going to write a book on this. Actually, I thought of a name. The Church and Her Craftsmen.
I like that name.
Ooh, good name.
Am I better now, Alex? He was saying my mic's low.
Yeah, you are.
All right, cool.
Yeah, because there are those, especially there's the Moscow Mood, and those people who have rightly emphasized the need to rest, the need to feast, the need to fight, the need to worship, the need to sing. They have put proper emphasis on the applied theology in those areas. And I think they're some of the first for our generation to really call attention to it in that way.
Yep.
But it's got to go from there. It can't stop there.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think, with that being said, trying to dovetail the two topics back together, we have very much an intent from God for things to be beautiful right out of the gate. In Genesis, he has the intent for things to be beautiful, and thus we should have the intent for things to be beautiful, not just in our art, but in our everyday work and lives, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing that is interesting to me is in this conversation about authorial intent is when someone who is a Christian, who has a righteous idea of beauty, can, in their estimation, find beauty in a place that was intentionally unbeautiful by the other author. This is the weirdest example of something. This is the strangest anomaly in our discussion of this whole thing, right? So as a very basic example, there are some of these movies are escaping me, but I know that there are movies that I have seen, and we've talked about on Story to Screen back in the day, Benjamin, that I saw particular interesting ideas and things in a movie where it was clear that that was not what they were intending to push forward, and what they were intending to push forward was at least disgusting, if not outright evil. But I wanted to point those things out, even separate from the piece of art overall, because we can learn from it. Oh, Firefly is a really good example because of some of the things that Joss Whedon says have those little layers of truth. It takes a lot of truth to float a lie, as G.K. Chesterton says, right? So Firefly and Serenity are a really, really good example of this. Buffy, I would say most of Joss Whedon's work, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, it's a feminist text in colleges. Like they literally study it in colleges for feminism's sake, right? But there's heroism, there's this, that's that, and the other, and yeah, we can chalk it up to image of God. But where do we sit there and go? Where and when do we sit there and go, well, God intended Buffy the Vampire Slayer to at least a few people make them more heroic and inspire them to be more heroic in their everyday life.
It's the straight lines with crooked sticks.
Right. Right. And so at that point, does the authorial intent even matter?
I think you're going on two different planes, and I don't think you should.
Yeah, because when something is so intentionally perverted, even if it contains elements of truth, I think I'm just kind of musing out loud here.
Sure.
I think we may have a duty as Christians to reject it
Whole cloth?
and call it out. Not necessarily whole cloth, but by and large say this is a lie.
Mhm.
And
Yes.
make it very clear that it is. So when someone makes we use softer words for things like that. We have folklore, we have myth, we have these things that have extended out of the author's reach and have become the people themselves, the culture has become the author.
Apocryphal.
But it takes on, yeah, but it takes on such untruth
Mhm.
that I think we generally I think it may be in our best interest to reject such things.
I mean, we do that all the time.
What I for one of the things, okay, we're about to celebrate Easter. The Easter Bunny would be one of those things that I think as Christians in Mass we reject. Does it seem harmless and fun? And is it billed as harmless and fun? Fun, yes. Harmless, no. It not only distracts from the only thoroughly Christian holiday that we have, but it teaches a lie to children who are looking to us to give them truth and will believe and swallow anything. And so it lays the foundation, I think, for more lie telling in subtler ways as they grow, buried into this, cotton candy and roses and,
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So in that regard, I think that you want to go ahead, Alex? Go ahead.
No, Brendan is wanting to
Brendan?
say something. Yeah.
Well, one, because I'm full of random factoids. Colored eggs came about actually.
I knew you were going to do this.
Because
Yep.
Chickens don't stop laying eggs for Lent, and the monks figured, well, if we're going to get all these eggs, we might as well make them beautiful, and so they painted the eggs. It was fun.
Yep.
Well, to Benjamin's point about us rejecting evil stories outright, we do that all the time. Pornography. It's a story. It has a kernel of truth in it.
Right.
What is the kernel of truth? Within the marriage bed, sex is beautiful.
Right.
And sex is enticing. Sorry, content warning for anybody listening.
No, it's fine. We get this deep all the time. It's fine.
But we reject those stories outright because of how heinous, even if there is a kernel of truth in that it's enjoyable and that it's all this stuff, right? It's because it's been so perverted. But I think, Joshua, when you're talking about God taking stories that are like the examples that you gave, the more benign examples where there is truth and there are good things that God uses in these stories, I almost don't want to say that those are the same thing, because what's happening is God is telling his story. God is telling his own story, and he's using those moments to shape us from our character. We'll call it the micro and the macro story. Because we're in the story right now, we can only work within the story. We cannot break free. The reason why characters like Deadpool are so compulsive and so not compulsive, but so compelling and so interesting and draw us in is because why? They can break the fourth wall.
Right.
Yeah.
And what God has done through redemptive history and through Christ has allowed us to break the fourth wall and join the author.
Yeah.
Through that.
Yeah.
So what this means, though, then, is that when we're dealing with the individual stories that the author intends, we cannot rely on it's not that we can't rely on God, but we cannot expect God to use every negative story in every way. And if we can't rely on that, we have to work within the confines of our micro story, or we have to work within the confines of the story that we are limited to, because even though God lets us break the fourth wall, we got to be smart in our story. And our fourth wall breaking is frankly just, as far as we're concerned, limited to salvation.
Okay. So with that,
Yeah.
Go ahead. Do you want me to go ahead with my follow-up or no?
Go ahead and go with your follow-up. I won't forget what I was saying.
So the question then becomes, if Joss Whedon was to become a Christian, would that in any way throw a sanctifying work? I'm not arguing for that, by the way. Would that anyway throw a sanctifying blanket back over the things that he has created, and or if he goes authorial intent and re-edits, or blah blah blah, etc., etc. Or also, is that different from Samson, who is in the Hall of Fame of Faith regardless of all of his issues, because he was an Old Testament Christian? Like, it seems like we're tying the author's salvation to his authorial intent in some manner, shape, or form. And yes, his intent is going to be drawn one way or the other based upon what his worldview is. I agree with you there. But it's almost as if we're tying value and worth for a Christian to the authorial intent. And that's where I have a weird... I'm like, what's going on here?
I don't know how you're getting that.
Okay, my bad. I missed something, I guess.
Well, yeah.
Hazel was saying goodnight, so sorry.
Oh, that's fair. That's fair. No, but I'm just one. No, but like, you clearly have this thought that you think we're saying that authorial intent is somehow tied, or how salvation. There's some connection there. But earlier, at least earlier, I was trying to say that the authorial intent has to happen in the moment of time when they're writing.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't think Joss Whedon being saved would put a blanket thing over all of his work, but
the only thing that would do is he would be able to go back and do a commentary and say, it's really interesting to see how these points changed. Like, that's a lie, but this one is still true according to and commentary, but that's not authorial intent. That is just my musings on the thing that I created.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and tying back into interpretation of the audience, the author is going to have the clearest picture. And so when he explains his interpretation, he does have more authority than a typical audience member in that regard.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because he is going to be able to explain exactly what he intended.
Why Tolkien? Why did you name the King of Rohan Theoden?
Right.
He has a better grasp as to why he did that than a random person reading it does.
Right.
Correct.
And so in that regard, and I wasn't accusing either you or Benjamin of that in any way, Brendan. The thing that I am saying is more general than you guys. There's a tendency to be, I find, there's a sifting that must take place. And Benjamin and I have talked a lot about sifting, fictional works especially, but even like works of philosophers and people who, there are people who are quote unquote transgender that are still in their right mind enough to write a good manual on how to fix a TV. You know what I'm saying? Like that's still a thing, right? And so
common grace abounds.
Right. And so
yeah,
I'm saying the biggest issue I see with going with a authorial intent, for example, the GIF question, is not taking GIF versus GIF, right? Pronunciation is not taking into account the actual. It's not taking into account the actual validity of the author's intent based upon the entirety of truth. And it also does not leave a whole lot of room to thank God in the case of a Joss Whedon for the sifted good. Right? Because you can thank God for the good that has come from a work of ill authorial intent. right?
Is there a line?
Right. Yeah, I think that
Because this gets back to what Benjamin was saying as far as that goes. The one that immediately comes to mind is Game of Thrones.
right. Yes.
This is one of the things that Cross-Politic hit. Oh, who was it? Was it David French? Yeah, it was David French on like a long time ago. They had him on and he was talking about how he loved Game of Thrones, and they're like, that's not an okay thing to love.
Right. And I agree with that.
There's something wrong if that's okay to love. And he's going on and talking about how, oh yes, there's this connection and this truth and this story and all that type of stuff. And they're like, number one, it's porn.
Right. That's the main the main valid point.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Number two, it completely lies about the nature of the universe and everything. Like, it does not take place in reality. It takes place in some form of dark emo mirror reality.
Right.
Those are the two criticisms
I would
have on it, and that like at that point in time, you've gone beyond the pale of this lie is, you know,
right.
That's at least over the line.
Right.
There might be the line might be closer, but that's over the line.
Well, and in that regard, David French is refusing to think on whatever is lovely, whatever is true, whatever. He has rejected that. And so as a Christian, we say, what's going on, man?
Right.
We need to talk to your elders.
Right. Yeah. But now hold on. No, but I kind of want to push back a little bit, because now it sounds like we're going to get into the question of, does this mean that a Christian has to listen to Christian rock?
Right.
No.
Because I'm sorry, I'm going to punch out my eardrums if I have to listen to that slosh.
All right, so this is
Christian.
This is fundamentally as well a Christian liberty conversation. And so the question we have to ask ourselves right at the get-go is art neutral?
No.
No, it is not.
There is no neutral ground.
Correct. This is not a bourbon. This is not tobacco.
Right.
Those things are neutral, good creations of God, that can be misapplied and abused.
Right.
That's
and
that is not this.
And to be clear, I would say that both porn and written smut cause the same sinning in the heart of anyone who produces it. And it is specifically the creation of those things that cross over the line into the marriage bed, which is not to be fictionalized in the largest sense. I think there are subtle ways to do it in certain books. Alex will understand when I say Lawhead. Yes, Lawhead walks right up to the line in the Song of Albion, and he does it beautifully and perfectly, and keeps the marriage bed as beautiful and intact. Wonderfully, masterfully done.
Closer to the line in the King Raven trilogy.
Right. And so in regard to that, there are ways to do this with actual really well done stuff, but people aren't trying to do well done stuff. They're trying to let their sinful heart go nuts and whatever else, and even Christians in this regard. And so I would argue that the second point you made about Game of Thrones is less the issue, because there are horrible times where it appears in our sinful fallen nature to be as bad as Game of Thrones. And in that regard, portraying that world as it is, while a lie, is a true experience that someone has felt. Okay, so that's different, because because it's fantasy.
But to what ends?
Right, exactly. No, I agree. Okay. I'm all with you on that.
And this is why I have an issue with horror as a genre. Horror as a genre intentionally focuses on the ugly,
right,
for the sake of the ugly.
Not always, but yes, most of the time. No, I would agree. I would agree most of the time.
I think
Hitchcock. Hitchcock, you would disagree. Come on, man.
Hitchcock is thriller.
Right.
Hitchcock is thriller.
Right, but
horror. Those are two separate genres.
That's fair. That's fair. But in regard to that, this is a definitional semantic thing, because there are places where horror and the shock of horror.
You're gonna go Grimm's fairy tale army, aren't you?
Yes, I'm going Grimm's fairy tale, but also I would recommend anyone watch not with your little kids, but The Babadook. The Babadook is absolutely terrifying, because A, it shows the depravity of humanity in full display, and it shows how close that depravity can look to the demonic in a very real sense. Fantastic Australian film, and I would classify it as horror more than thriller, because you don't realize it's a thriller till toward the very end. It appears to be completely like next level horror, scary stuff, right? But their intent and their point that they're actually making through that movie is more about humankind than it is about the scary, right? And I remember it was either Cross Politic or Stories or Soul Food, and I can't remember which, but I remember someone bringing up the point that horror, horror rightly done, I would argue, is law without gospel. And
this is Stories or Soul Food.
This is Stories or Soul Food. And essentially, law without gospel can become absolute crap. I mean, it really can. It can be horrible. This is what the horror that Benjamin's talking about, right? The slasher gore type stuff that really has no other point than the two teenagers that are making out behind the bleachers are going to get killed because karma, right?
Yeah.
And so like that's law without gospel.
And everyone did what was right in their own eyes.
Right.
Can you think of a more terrifying verse than that?
Yeah, for real.
No.
And in that regard, Judges is an amazing story because we don't have the gospel yet, but it's coming, right? And so it should never be completely, whatever horror, thriller, whatever you want to call it that you write or make, it should have an understanding that there is truth, beauty, and goodness in the world, but it is so far from you that you are in serious trouble. That's where it shines. Not in the absence of truth, beauty, and goodness, but in it's so far away you can't touch it. It's not there. And that's where I'm saying the Game of Thrones world would have been a good thing as far as like the evil and stuff that they put in it, right? The mafioso, kind of thing that's going on. If it wasn't for the fact of the pornography, and it doesn't have truth, beauty, or goodness in the world to fall back on.
Yeah,
right?
but I would argue that even if you could, and here's where I go back and forth on services like VidAngel, even if you removed where all of these elements, these sinful elements, and why are we still consuming it? There are better things.
I would say that the one good reason in that regard would be so that you can parse when you run across it.
Children of Hurin is the exact same thing as Game of Thrones, but written by a Christian.
Yes, agreed. Yes. 100%. It absolutely is.
So in that case, Game of Thrones actually is true.
There you go.
Why? Because in Game of Thrones, there is no God.
Right.
And a world without God is terrible.
Yes.
Well done, sir.
So,
well done.
Yeah.
Finally, I can get a word in edgewise.
You're good. I was getting to you.
So Game of Thrones, and so my hot take, what I was going to say at the beginning was Game of Thrones is true, and then say because there is no God, and Children of Hurin is the exact same thing. So when you get the awfulness that is Game of Thrones, and to Benjamin's point, I think this is a Paul be kind to the lesser brother scenario, where like if you alcohol consumption, right? Yes, we've established that alcohol is generally neutral, but and despite the fact that drunkenness is condemned multiple times, but anyway,
right.
Alcohol is neutral, art is not. Okay, we've established this. So Game of Thrones isn't a positive force by any stretch of the imagination. However, going back to what Joshua said with what you meant for evil, God meant for good, what we can see from Game of Thrones is that, assuming we take out all the pornography, is that you have a world without God and it is awful.
Yep.
Now, Children of Hurin, there is God.
Mm-hmm.
And the characters have moments of heroism in them. But the Children of Hurin is still a tragedy.
Yes.
It is ultimately a tragedy. And I think that there is a benefit to us consuming tragedies in moderation, as we should consume heroic tales in moderation, as we should consume dance music in moderation, and all of that. As for horror, I haven't thought very deeply about horror, so
Okay.
but the only note that I took away from that, at least for me, my initial thought is horror movies can only really be awful if evil ultimately wins in the end, right?
Which is a lie.
Right.
Which is a lie that
which
we
is-
reject.
Yes.
If evil ultimately wins in the end, then it's bad. You get some
Or even if evil cannot ultimately be killed.
What's the spinning thing? The spinning head movie. Oh my gosh, what's it called?
Exorcism.
Exorcist. Right. Yeah, The Exorcist.
Exorcist.
Any movie that like those supernatural style things, usually the evil gets banished, and if the people live with like some like the weight of the events haunts them for their life, like terrible things, like it's not, I say haunts them, as long as we show them like moving on, even if they struggle with the weight of the events that happen to them, like I'm okay with that to a certain degree. But again, now we're getting into the weeds of how is it executed, and that is that's where like I can see Benjamin's point. I don't like horror. I don't like watching horror because I don't like being scared.
Right.
It's not like I don't go, you know how I want to enjoy my night tonight? I'm going to scare the bleeps out of me. No, I don't enjoy that. It's not entertaining for me. So I generally don't watch horror.
Right.
But at the same time, if we want to deal with any movie where there is a threat that doesn't seem to be beatable has a certain horror from that.
Yes.
It's not horror like the genre, right? And now I'm conflating words, and that's kind of unfair because the English language sucks. But yeah, anyway, I guess it's
not the English language's fault, though.
Overcoming evil is the important point of the story and what is good and true and beautiful. And when we're looking and when we consume content that isn't good, true, or beautiful, I think that we need to be careful. I don't want to make a blanket statement and say no, never, because I enjoy a tragedy as much as the next person. Again, Arcane has a ton of problems with it. But as a tragedy, watching a character fall from a joyful person to a monster and watching the character interactions, it was magnificently well done, and I'm glad I watched it, right? Even with all of its issues. Is it good, true, and beautiful? I really need to go back and try to figure that out, to be honest. But I don't think that we can say that it's at the same level of The Lord of the Rings,
right?
Which is good, true, and beautiful, or The Hobbit or Narnia or any of those. Sorry, Alex.
No. It's fine. 2 points. One on VidAngel that we'll get back to if we have time, and 2. Is there a difference between tragedy, like capital T Greek tragedy? I'm thinking specifically of the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, and Christian tragedy. Peter Lightheart talks about this in Deep Comedy. Super good book. Definitely a tough read, but worth reading. Where he says that whenever Jesus came, the nature of like everything changed, and that also includes storytelling.
Right.
Because before Jesus came, you had Greek tragedy, like Orpheus and Eurydice, or Prometheus Bound.
Right.
Where how does the story, guy does the good stuff and then looks backward and, well, you're plumb out of luck. Sorry, dude. The story ends badly. And that's it. That's all there is. That's all there is to the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. You do good, and then, you screw up one time and everything's over. Sucks to be you.
Yep.
Hades Town specifically is what I'm thinking of. It doesn't change the myth at all, and I don't enjoy it.
Right.
Like, it's got great music, but I don't enjoy that, because even like the greatest tragedies written for Christian culture, Shakespeare's, even Romeo and Juliet ends on and the families realized that they were doing wrong. Yes, it's tragic. It's terrible.
Right.
The fact that they kill themselves and, destroy two young, promising lives is terrible and awful, and he doesn't soften that blow at all. But because he's a Christian, he also has this understanding of, okay, but there's other things going on. The story doesn't end there.
Right.
And
Bingo.
Greek tragedy ends there.
Right.
Bingo. Yeah.
I would assume that Arcane does the Shakespeare thing. It's a tragedy, but it doesn't end there.
Well, at the first season, it does.
And then
But
it keeps
there's
going. There's more seasons.
expectation of
Yeah.
continuation.
Expectation of another
There's-
season. Yes.
Right.
Expectation
Yes.
of hope.
Yes. And now that's what Rings of Power is not doing.
Right.
Rings of Power is I want to love it. I want to love it so
Get our
much.
baseball bats. Get our
But
baseball
they-
bats. Beat the doors.
They are intentionally, deliberately corrupting everything true and beautiful to shoehorn in this great evil that's coming.
Right.
Yep.
And in that regard,
Frickin'
I'll throw one more tragedy on the pile, and this definitely fits more in line with the it fits more in line with the lowercase t, as Alex put it, versus the Greek capital T, right? Whatever. But I think there's an element of both in it, and that is the movie The Wrestler with Mickey Rourke. That movie is about a man who was a professional wrestler in the 80s, very much mirroring people like Hulk Hogan and Lex Luger and, Jake the Snake Roberts and a lot of these wrestlers that, basically after they got out of wrestling, there's even a song in the movie that's part of the soundtrack that's called One Trick Pony. Right. And the idea is they were a one trick pony. And as soon as they were not valuable in that job anymore, they had no skills to go out and do anything else.
Mhm.
And the story ends, spoiler for some people, but basically with Randy the Ram, the Mickey Rourke's character, diving off the turnbuckle in the ring at 50 something years old. And it's framed in such a way that he dies in the ring. Like, it's framed that way. We don't see him die in the ring. We don't know for sure, but it's framed in that way. There's a song playing as he's diving in slow motion at the end of the movie. And it's very, very sad, extremely sad, because this guy kept trying to get a leg up on life and kept getting kicked back down because he was never given the skills to do what he needed to do outside of a wrestling ring. Right. And it's sad, and it's a great story because it's true and because it inspires people to say, hey, who do you know who's like this? How can you keep this from happening? Right?
So you're saying it's more like a parable than a straight
It
story.
is much more like a parable, but it's a parable in such a way that a lot of the details legitimately one-to-one reflect several different real people that this has happened to, right?
Yeah.
Probably a half dozen people they pull literal life events from for this character. And it hits so hard because of that, right? And that's a tragedy in a way that we can actually, it's so real that we can actually take something from it, And so that's another example of the hyper realism as a tragedy, right? But it has hope in that we can change. It's the Rocky IV thing, right? If I can change, you can change anyway. But yeah. So,
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
And I think that there is a place for that.
Yes.
I think that there is a place for morality plays. There is a place for, this is the story. If you don't want it to end this way, then go out and actually change something.
Right.
In a certain sense, the Lorax is that, except for it has like the more hopeful ending at the end.
Right.
But it's that same push. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. But without the hope, it's just the bitterness of, come on, we have to fix this thing.
Right.
And there is a place for that. But that's a fundamentally different thing than like a straight story.
True. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because like we have different categories for that. We understand it differently.
Right.
We understand
right.
that Jesus's parables are not supposed to be, realistic in timbre and tone and characterization. They're supposed to be real and true and teach us how to live.
Think about
And
this.
that is
Jesus left
completely
that.
different.
Jesus left that. Think about this for a second. This is humbling.
Mhm.
Jesus left that to Tolkien.
Yep. Yeah.
That's actually really humbling on a humanity level, that he did not come and give us Lord of the Rings,
Mhm.
in
In
the
the
parables.
incarnation.
Yeah. In the incarnation, in the parables.
He did with his fiction, not with his nonfiction.
Right. Yes. I understand what you're saying.
Mhm.
And I agree with you, but yeah. We could get back to VidAngel. I don't know if you need to go, Benjamin. We're going to be wrapping here in 10 minutes, even if you can stay.
More.
Okay. Did you want to touch VidAngel, Alex, before we rock? And then the last thing I want to end on is it GIF or GIF? Definitively, between the four of us. Okay. So go ahead, Alex, with VidAngel.
Yeah, the VidAngel thing is, you were saying you waffle back and forth on VidAngel because if there are deeper problems there, then even if you cut out the language, the stuff that's like on the surface level, there's still going to be those deeper problems there, and you're going to be ingesting that and taking it in. So you're not actually fixing the problem, right?
Correct. And I think it's a case by case depending on the piece of art. So for something like Game of Thrones, I don't think even removing those makes it worthwhile. Something like, The Office. Well, you can't actually filter The Office. You lose all the meat. So,
what'd you say, Brendan?
Movies,
Brendan, you said something.
You lose all the jokes. That's all.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right.
The movies that the two movies that I would immediately go to are two of my favorite movies of all time: Jojo Rabbit, which is fantastic and phenomenal, and a lot of people know about, and then one that virtually nobody knows about, which is Steve Jobs, directed by Danny Boyle, written by Aaron Sorkin. Fantastic film. There's like 10 or 12 F words in it.
Because I was going to say, which Steve Jobs?
It's not the one with Ashton Kutcher. It's the one with Michael Fassbender.
Yes. Yeah. Fantastic film.
Yeah. Fantastic film. I personally I don't have a problem with the language that's in it, because that's who Jobs was. Mm-hmm. And I think that it tells a true story about it. I own the biography. I love it. It's great. It's fantastic.
So now, do you think it is sinful for foul language like that to be recorded and replayed?
I don't think so. I haven't heard a convincing argument that it is. I think that
blasphemy is the sin of blasphemy when someone misuses God's name. Is that redone? Is the sin recommitted when it's recorded and replayed?
Recommitted? No, I think that it's a sin to record. I don't know.
So
maybe.
So my point being,
way to open up a can of worms right at the end. Anyway, go ahead.
If these things are a sin to or not a sin to hear, then why are we filtering?
Why does VidAngel exist?
Yes.
Which is kind of where I've pushed towards, is that if it's being used correctly, I guess, or in moderation, like as I said, that's who Steve Jobs was.
If we want someone, our friend who's an alcoholic, we just don't go to the bar with them.
Yeah.
But VidAngel would say, no, go to the bar and we'll serve them a Coke.
Yeah.
Like, well, I don't know about the wisdom of that.
So on basically, you're saying on either side, depending on how these questions are answered, on either side, it's useless. Either it's completely unhelpful or it's completely unnecessary. Depending on how you answer the question.
I think I'm saying that without wanting to say that, because I have not thought about that deeply enough. But it's something, like I said, I've gone back and forth on.
Yeah, and the asterisk to that, it being completely unnecessary, would be like kids. You know, if you're going through American history with your 12-year-old and you don't want them to hear, you know, the 15 F words or whatever that are in Steve Jobs, you know, sure, get a VidAngel subscription, filter it, let them watch it, and then, you know, whenever they're 16, 17, say, yeah, you can watch it now because you understand it, you get it. That would be the utility of it.
That would be a utility of it, yes. And I think that's the only rationale, I think. But even then, I can think of a lot of different ways to get the point across without. Maybe I don't know.
Yeah. I just thought
that would
was
be the
interesting,
utility.
Deep discussion on VidAngel is kind of rare, and stuff like that is kind of a lot more rare than it used to be. I know that a lot of this happened like 5-10 years ago, and I haven't heard a lot of it recently. So,
well, regardless of whether people are cursing or not, everyone feels a whole lot more like cursing after 2020. So. All right.
You're not wrong.
Alrighty. So, okay. I'm going to go ahead and ask, and we can go around the horn without any kind of not capitulate. What's the term?
Explanation.
GIF or GIF?
No.
Yep.
I need explanation.
You need explanation. We'll let you go last and let you explain. You're the pretty princess this time. All right. So, Benjamin.
GIF with a soft G.
GIF, because I'm not going to say it because I'm not going to explain. Go ahead. GIF.
I anger everybody. I pronounce it GIF.
There you go.
GIF because as I said with Authorial Intent, sometimes the author is sinful and screws up.
Well, there we go. There we have it, people. Make of that what you will. Everybody be your family's bard. Do not turn to the right or to the left, and the Lord will be with you wherever you go. We'll see you next time in the trenches on Poets at War.